Hello everyone, it's Scott, and today we're back for day 5 of Murders at Karlov Manor spoilers. We got a lot of interesting cards to talk about, so let's dive into Murders at Karlov Manor. So first we've got Anzrag the Quake Mole for 2 and a red and a green mana. You get a legendary creature that's a mole god. It's an 8/4. And whenever Anzrag the Quake Mole becomes blocked, untap each creature you control. After this combat phase, there is an additional combat phase. For 3, 2 red, and 2 green, Anzrag must be blocked each combat this turn if able. So very interesting card. Certainly on the face of it, an 8/4 for 4, great value, particularly if you can find a way to give it haste so it can attack the turn that it comes into play. And I think the thing that makes this card exciting is if there's a way to you can force your opponent to block Anzrag, then you're going to get multiple attacks each and every turn. And it is really honestly quite possible that your opponent not blocking Anzrag is simply a game ender for them anyways, because that 8 power really pushes a lot of damage. So I think Gruul decks are going to want to try this in Standard. Whether it's going to be good enough or not, I'm not 100% sure, but I think this is something that's certainly worth attempting to play in Standard, and it has a lot of upside to it if we can make this thing work. Certainly getting to that 7 mana where you're forcing your opponent to block it, that would be great. So maybe a ramp deck is really where this thing goes, but we'll have to find out as we get into Murders at Karlov Manor Standard Season. Next, we've got Undergrowth Recon. For 1 and 2 green mana, you get an enchantment, and at the beginning of your upkeep, return target land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So I think this is a very good card for us in Standard, because we've already got decks that want to get cards into the graveyard, and we've got our Tri-lands from New Capenna that you can cycle to draw a card, and we've got other cards where you sacrifice them and they do something for us, whether it's Field of Ruin where it destroys a land, or cards from the current set where you're going to get that discover a trigger on those cards. So I think there's enough stuff out there that this is going to see Standard play. The question is finding the right deck for it, and right now green is not the strongest of the colors in Magic right now, so finding the right deck I think is going to be what's going to either make or break this card when it comes to Standard. Next we've got Archdruid's Charm. For 3 green mana, you get an instant, and you get to choose one. Search your library for a creature or a land card and reveal it. Put it onto the battlefield tapped if it's a land, otherwise put it in your hand, then shuffle. Or put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. Or exile target artifact or enchantment. So a lot of abilities on this card. So I think in older formats, and certainly in Commander, this is going to be a very desirable card because it gives you so much flexibility. You know, you can fight something, and it's a bite spell in the sense that you're doing the damage to another creature, so you're likely to kill something that way. Exile an important artifact or enchantments is also a very strong ability, and then searching your library for a land that you need or a creature that you need is also a powerful ability. And from a Standard standpoint, I don't know how really playable this is going to be because it requires 3 green mana. So if we did have a mono green stompy type deck, then I think this would be a good card in that. But the problem with it is that 3 green mana makes it hard to play in multiple colored decks. So we'll have to see if this sees any play at all in Standard. Next, we've got Lazav, Wearer of Faces. For a blue and a black mana, you lend your creature. That's a Shapeshifter Detective. It's a 2/3. When Lazav, Wearer of Faces attacks, exile target card from a graveyard, then investigate. So right there, I think that investigate ability is nice. You attack with it, you get to investigate. But what makes the card potentially powerful is whenever you sacrifice a clue, you may have Lazav become a copy of a creature card exiled with it until end of turn. Now, the downside of this is you have to crack a clue every time to accomplish that goal of giving Lazav the ability to go ahead and become another creature. And I think in Standard, that's going to be a little bit hard for it to do, given what we have already right now in the 2-drop spot. Because I think this is probably a card that Esper would be looking at as a potential card in an Esper Legends deck or the Esper mid-range deck, because it's got a lot of upside with it. But the problem is we've already got a lot of good cards at the 2-drop spot already in that deck, so I don't think it's going to be able to take out one of those. So I think Lazav, if it does seem play in Standard, it's going to be down the road. Next, we've got Hunted Bone Brute. For 2 and a black mana, you get a Skeleton Beast. It's a 6/2 with Menace. And when Hunted Bone Brute enters the battlefield, target opponent creates 2 1/1 white dog creature tokens, and when Hunted Bone Brute dies, each opponent loses 3 life, and you can disguise Hunted Bone Brute, and its disguise cost is 1 and a black mana. So it's an interesting card. 6/2 is a lot of power on the card, but pretty much anything in Standard can block this, so I don't see it as something that really will see a lot of Standard play, because if you're going to have to block with 2 cards, you're going to kill it most likely on that turn it was blocked. Now, the upside of it is that you're probably going to kill the 2 creatures that your opponent played, but unfortunately, Hunted Bone Brute is giving your opponent 2 creatures that are going to be able to block it. So I think this is more of a meme card than anything else. I don't think it's going to see a lot of Standard play, if at all. Next, we've got Treacherous Greed. For 1, a white and a black mana. As initial cost to cast the spell, sacrifice a creature that dealt damage this turn. Draw 3 cards. Each opponent loses 3 life, and you gain 3 life. So, interesting cost in this. So it's 3 mana, plus you have to sacrifice a creature that did damage this turn. So I'm really not sure if there's a true place for this in Standard, and I'm thinking this is more of a limited card where you use this, you need some card draw, so you do that, and opponent's going to gain some, you're going to gain some life, your opponent will lose some life. So while I thought initially this might have some Standard playability, the more I look at it, the more I think about it, I think this is something that will only see limited play, because the downside of having to have a creature that deals damage is probably one that is almost too high for the value, for the benefit of what the card is going to do for you. Next, we've got Case of the Crimson Pulse. For 2 and a red mana. When this case enters the battlefield, discard a card, then draw 2 cards. Okay, a little bit expensive for that ability, but because of the value that you're potentially generating, maybe that's something you would consider and want to do in Standard. To solve, you have to have no cards in your hand. Okay, and that's it at the beginning of your end step, which I think in red isn't a real problem, because mono red runs itself out of cards regularly. And then once it's solved at the beginning of your upkeep, discard your hand, then draw 2 cards. So when you solve it, the next turn basically you're getting the benefit of drawing 2 cards, which I think potentially even getting 4 cards for 2 cards, I think may have enough value in Standard that some kind of deck will want this, that wants some card draw that doesn't necessarily have it naturally. And certainly maybe in a deck that wants to get cards into the graveyard, this might be a good card for that, because you know if you do empty your hand, you're going to be able to get 2 additional cards the next turn when you draw at that point. So we've got Push and Pull, another one of our split cards for today that we saw. And Push costs 1 and an Orzhov mana of white or black, and you get destroy target tap creature. So 2 mana destroy target tap creatures. Okay, not great. And we've got other cards that are similar to this in white already. So I'm not sure that that's going to be enough to make it Standard playable. On the other side, you get Pull for 6 mana and 4 and Rakdos color, black or red mana. Then you can put up to 2 target creature cards from a single graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. They gain haste until the end of turn. Sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step. So again, 6 mana. And I could see this as a finisher, at the end of a game, you need something to finish off your opponent. You lost some good creatures, and then you can bring those creatures back into play or out of your opponent's graveyard, put them back into play, and then go ahead and hopefully win the game on that turn. But 6 mana for an instant is, or sorry, in this case, a sorcery on both sides, is really high. So I don't think this is going to see much, if any, standard play. Next, we've got Absolving Lamassu. For 4 and a white mana, you get a Lamassu. It's a 4/3 with flying. And when Absolving Lamassu enters the battlefield, all suspected creatures are no longer suspect. The ability to take off the suspect counter on your creatures is a good thing. And it's all suspected creatures, so it's on both sides. So that may not be something that's actually profitable in the long run, but it does that. And when Absolving Lamassu dies, you gain 3 life and suspect up to 1 target creature an opponent controls. So I think, this is definitely a limited playable card, but I don't see any standard playability right now, unless we have a dedicated deck that wants to use a suspect mechanic. And in the way this is worded, I don't think that's going to be really standard playable. Next, we've got Fester Leech. For a black mana, you get a zombie leech. That's a 1/1. And whenever Fester Leech deals combat damage to a player, you mill 2 cards. And for 1 and a black mana, Fester Leech gets +2/+2 until end of turn, activating only once each turn. So the ability to make it a 3/3 to get some damage through, I think, has some playability because of that. But I think this is more of a limited card, or you want it in a deck that is a dedicated mill deck where you're trying to mill things into the graveyard. Outside of that, I don't really see it as standard playable. Next, we've got Presumed Dead. For 1 and a black mana, you get an instant. Until end of turn, target creature gets +2/+0 and gains when this creature dies. Return it to the battlefield under its owner's control and suspect it. So, this is an interesting card. We've got almost every set now. It seems like we've got a black card that does this, where you target a creature, it gets some combat advantage, and then when it dies on that turn, you get to return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. In this case, you get the suspect counter, which may have some value in the game. I think we'll have to see more cards from the set to figure out if suspect is something that we really care about. So if it is, I think this is a good, decent card for that deck. But otherwise, I don't see this as seeing standard play because we've got better options already in standard. Next, we've got Case of the Trampled Garden. For 2 and a green mana. When this case enters the battlefield, distribute 2 +1/+1 counters among 1 or 2 creature you control. To solve, creatures you control have total power 8 or greater, which I don't think is something that's going to be a problem in standard. Getting 8 power onto the battlefield, especially since you're putting 2 power onto the battlefield when you cast this. So I think it won't be hard to solve this. Maybe even on the turn it comes into play. And if it is solved, then whenever you attack, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature that's attacking. It gains trample until the end of turn. And I think that solved ability is what will attract people to it in standard. The ability to give a card trample in green is very powerful. Trample is probably one of the best abilities in the game because it allows you to, in essence, attack through creatures. So because of that, I think this has some standard playability in the right kind of deck. One that's going to solve it almost immediately, and then that ability to give that +1/+1 counter every turn, and that trample ability, I think, is enough to make it standard playable. Next, we've got Sample Collector. For 2 and a green mana, you get a Troll Detective. That's a 2/3. And whenever Sample Collector attacks, you may collect evidence 3. When you do, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So, generic card. I think this is a limited card, and I think in limited it'll be fine. But I don't see this as standard playable because you would have to constantly be putting cards in your graveyard to activate this ability, and I think we just have better cards in standard that do more things. Next, we have Bull Race Clan Basher. For 4 and 2 red mana. You get a Cyclops Warrior. It's a 3/2 with double strike and trample. So trample ability is nice on this, but 6 mana for a 3/2. It does have disguise for 5, 3 and 2 red mana, so that ability to potentially flip it could be important in the game, and that trample is nice, but the 6 mana cost I think is what makes it really outside of standard playability. I think in limited, this is a card I'd want to put in my deck because I can disguise it early in the game and then flip it later, and that later flip, now I've got double strike, now I've got trample, and that can lead to some very powerful attacks in standard. All right, that's day 5 of spoilers from Murders at Karlov Manor. We got a lot of interesting cards. I don't really see much as standard playable here. I think this is more limited stuff that we're seeing, or stuff that was meant for other formats. So hopefully we'll get more from Sunday's previews from Murders at Karlov Manor. Thanks for watching. I will see you next time, and take a look at our couple of videos that we did earlier this week for Murders at Karlov Manor spoilers. Thanks. I'll see you next time.